A follower named Marcos sent me this story a few days ago, and since I read it, I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. Before I start, if you have any inexplicable experiences you'd like to share, leave them in the comments. I love reading them. Marcos lived in an old building in downtown Bogota, one of those buildings that have more history accumulated in the walls than one would care to imagine. He didn't believe in anything supernatural. He was an engineer, a man of logic, of concrete solutions. But what began as strange noises in his apartment ended up leading him to discover something about that building and about himself that forever changed the way he understands the world. This is his story. I arrived at the Restrepo building in March after getting my first stable job as a systems engineer at a firm in downtown Bogota. The building had 7 floors, a dark stone facade, and had been built in the 1940s. Apartment 4B was small but sufficient. Living room, kitchen, 1 bedroom, bathroom. The price was reasonable for the area. The manager, a lady in her 60s named Mrs. Carmen, handed me the keys with a kind smile and told me to report any plumbing issues before Friday. She didn't say anything else. The first few days were normal. I settled in, bought what I needed, learned the building's schedules. The neighbors were discreet, almost invisible. The one in 4A, a man in his 50s whom I saw twice in the elevator and who never returned my greeting. The couple in 3B, young, who played music on Saturdays until 11. The lady in 5A, older, who always smelled of rose water when I crossed paths with her in the hallway. Everything perfectly ordinary. It was in the second week when I started to hear the knocks. They were coming from inside the wall. Not from the wall that faced the neighbor's apartment, but from the back wall, which according to the building plans did not adjoin any other living space. 3 sharp knocks always at night, always between 1 and 3 in the morning. They weren't loud enough to be an alarm, but they were regular enough to be impossible to ignore. The first time I thought about pipes. Old buildings make strange noises. Pressurized water creates knocks in the pipes. There is thermal expansion in the materials. I explained everything to myself perfectly and went back to sleep. The second night, the knocks were accompanied by something else. A smell. It wasn't a strong or unpleasant smell. It was something subtle, almost pleasant in a way I didn't know how to articulate. Something like incense, but older, denser, as if it had been impregnated in the walls for decades. The third night I got up with a flashlight and checked the wall inch by inch. Old adobe, peeling paint in some areas, no significant cracks. Nothing that explained anything. I went to talk to Mrs. Carmen the next day. I found her in her office on the first floor, a small room with a desk full of papers and a picture of the Sacred Heart on the wall. I told her about the noises. She listened attentively, nodding with an expression I interpreted as professional concern over a maintenance issue. But when I mentioned the smell, something changed in her face. It was just a moment, a slight tightening around the eyes, a tension in the jaw. I saw it clearly, although she immediately concealed it. "The pipes on that floor are old," she said. "I will send someone to check." "And the smell." "Humidity," she said. "Old buildings smell like that." It wasn't humidity. I know what humidity smells like. But I didn't insist. That week I asked around the building, not directly about the noises, but in general, as if making conversation. I asked the lady from 5A, whom I frequently crossed paths with, if the building had a lot of history. She looked at me with a smile that seemed genuinely pleased by the question. "A lot," she said. "This building was a clinic before, in the 50s. A private clinic like the old ones." "How long was it a clinic?" "Almost 20 years, until they closed it down." "Why did they close it?" The lady from 5A adjusted her purse on her arm with a gesture that seemed deliberate. "Things that happen in business," she said, and changed the subject. That night I researched online. The Restrepo building, built in 1943. Private clinic from 1951 to 1968. I found nothing about the closure. There were no articles, no accessible digital records. Bogota in the mid-20th century was not well documented online. I went to the National Library Archive on a Saturday. It took me 3 hours to find something useful, a small note in a local newspaper from 1968. 4 lines. It said that the Restrepo Clinic had suspended operations by order of the health department after an unscheduled inspection. It didn't provide further details. An unscheduled inspection that closes a clinic is not a minor issue. That night, shortly after 1 in the morning, the knocks on the wall returned. But this time they came with something new. A voice. It wasn't a clear voice. It was more of a murmur, the kind of sound that one cannot distinctly identify from other nighttime noises unless paying attention. But I was paying attention, and what I heard, although I couldn't fully decipher it, had a cadence, a structure, the unmistakable rhythm of words. Someone, on the other side of that wall which according to the plans did not lead to any habitable space, was speaking. I got up. I pressed my ear directly against the cold adobe. The words remained indecipherable, but the smell was there again. Stronger this time. Old incense. Something sweet beneath it. Something I couldn't name but that caused me physical discomfort. A queasiness in my stomach that had no rational cause. I knocked on the wall 3 times with my knuckles. The murmuring stopped immediately. The silence that followed was absolute. Neither the normal noises of the building nor the distant traffic from the street. Just silence. And then, from the other side of the wall, 3 knocks responded to mine. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next day I went to see Mrs. Carmen with a different attitude. I didn't ask her about pipes or humidity. I directly told her that I knew the building had been a clinic and that I wanted to know what was behind the wall of my apartment. Mrs. Carmen looked at me for a moment that stretched uncomfortably. "A storage room," she finally said. "It's sealed. It's been sealed for years." "Why sealed?" "Structural problems," she said. "It's not safe to enter." "I want to see it." "There's no access from your apartment." "Where is there access?" Another silence. "Marcos," Mrs. Carmen said, and something in the tone with which she said my name alerted me. "There are things about this building that are better left undisturbed. Do you understand me? It's been this way for years and it should stay that way." "What happened in that clinic?" I asked directly. Doña Carmen lowered her gaze to her papers. "The doctor in charge was doing things he shouldn't," she said in a very low voice. "That's all I know, and it's all you need to know." She didn't say anything else, and it was clear that the conversation was over. That afternoon, I spoke with the man from 4A. I knocked on his door with little hope, because in weeks of neighborliness, we had exchanged no more than 4 words. He opened the door with a look of surprise or perhaps annoyance. It was hard to tell on his face. I told him I had questions about the building. I waited for him to close the door on me. Instead, he looked at me for a moment, stepped aside, and let me in. His apartment was a mirror of mine, same size, same layout. But where I had the problematic wall, he had a huge built-in closet that took up that entire section. "How long have you been here?" I asked him. 11 years, he said. "Have you heard things? At night?" The man, who never told me his name, was silent for a moment. Then he nodded, barely, a movement almost imperceptible. "The first few years, yes," he said. "After that, you learn not to listen." "What's behind that wall?" "A room," he said. "A room that was active when this was a clinic. The doctor used it for things that weren't medicine." "What kind of things?" The man looked at me with an expression that mixed weariness with something that could very well be tightly controlled fear. "The doctor was a spiritualist," he said. "The real kind, not the fairground type. He had patients who came for medicine and ended up in that room participating in things they didn't understand. When the health department arrived, they found records, sessions, things that didn't match any medical treatment. They closed the clinic, prosecuted the doctor, sealed the room, and what was left inside. What always remains, he simply said, when a door is opened that one doesn't know how to close properly. That night, armed with the most powerful flashlight I found at a nearby hardware store, I searched my apartment more carefully than ever. I measured the walls, I measured the space, and I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. Between my back wall and the building's exterior structure, there was a difference of almost 80 centimeters that did not correspond to the normal thickness of adobe. There was space there, real space, and that space had to have access from somewhere. I found it in the bathroom, behind the medicine cabinet mirror, which turned out to be a wooden door painted the same color as the wall, almost invisible if not looked for. It was closed with a rusty latch, the kind that opens from the inside and the outside. Logic told me to leave it alone, to call Mrs. Carmen to report the discovery, to not get my hands into something that had clearly been sealed for a reason. Logic told me all that very clearly. I opened the latch. The door gave way with a long, rough sound. as if the hinges had not been used for decades. On the other side was complete darkness and the smell, now concentrated, dense, almost suffocating. Incense, somewhat sweet, something beneath that which was harder to identify. Something that smelled, if I had to put a word to it, like time stopped. I entered with the flashlight. The room was small, about 4 meters by 3. The walls were covered with dark paper that had once had a pattern and was now so worn that it was impossible to distinguish it. In the center was a wooden table with remnants of completely burned candles, turned into small solidified pools of black wax. Around the table, 3 chairs. On the walls, at a height of 1 meter from the floor, there were marks drawn with something dark. They were not letters. They were not figures I could recognize. They were symbols that had a precise, repeated geometry, like a language I did not know. In a corner on the floor there was a small wooden box, the size of a shoebox, closed with a metal clasp. I approached the table. The chairs were positioned precisely around it, not pushed, not randomly, but placed deliberately, as if the last session had ended orderly and no one had returned afterward. The smell was almost unbearable near the table. And then I heard the murmur. It wasn't coming from the walls this time. It came from the very air of the room, from no specific point, and from all at once. Words that remained indecipherable, in a language I didn't recognize, with a cadence that had something hypnotic in the worst possible sense. The kind of sound that makes the mind want to follow it, trace it, find its origin, even though something deeper and instinctive screams to get out. I turned towards the door. It was closed. I hadn't closed it. I had left it open, but it was closed. I pushed. It didn't give. I pushed harder. Nothing. The murmur intensified. At that moment I made a decision that was not rational but purely physical. I screamed. I pounded on the door with both fists with all the strength I had and kept hitting it non-stop, not caring about the noise, not caring about anything else. The door opened. On the other side was the man from 4A, with a serious expression, in pajamas, with the latch in hand. He must have opened it from the other side because my door also connected to the mirror in his bathroom, something neither of us knew. I left the room. I leaned against the bathroom wall, breathing heavily. "I told you," said the man from 4A. "One learns not to listen." He helped me sit on the edge of the bathtub. Neither of us spoke for a moment. "What is in there?" I asked him when I could speak normally. "I don't know for sure," he said. "But the doctor spent years opening doors in that room, inviting things. And when they closed it quickly, without doing what needed to be done to close it properly. What needs to be done to close it properly?" The man looked at me for a moment. "I don't know," he said, "and I don't want to know. I left the Restrepo building 2 weeks later. I left most of the furniture. I canceled the contract with Mrs. Carmen, who did not protest or ask for reasons, which told me more than any explanation could have told me. I found a new apartment in another neighborhood, modern, built 10 years ago, with no history at all. That was 2 years ago. I haven't been back to that area of the center. Sometimes when I have to pass nearby for work, I take a detour. I had the dreams for a few months after I left. Always the same room, the same chairs around the same table, the same black candles. I would wake up with the smell still in my nose even though I was kilometers away from that building. Over time, the dreams diminished. Now they hardly come. But there are nights, for no apparent reason, when I wake up at 2 in the morning completely alert. And in the silence of my new apartment, in the building with no history, I hear, very far away, almost inaudible, almost possibly imagined, 3 knocks. Always 3. This is the account of Marcos. He wrote to me that he never returned to see what was inside that wooden box in the corner of the room. He says it is the only decision from that night that he does not regret. There are places that accumulate things that should not be accumulated, and doors that are better left unopened, even if curiosity weighs more than fear. If you have ever experienced something in a place with a dark history, tell me in the comments. I would love to read your experience. And if you like this story and haven't subscribed yet, I invite you to do so. There are many more waiting. Have a peaceful night. What I'm going to tell you tonight was sent to me by Rodrigo, a photographer who lives in Argentina and spent a weekend in the Cordoba Mountains that changed his way of understanding certain places. He wrote to me in detail, with that precision that people have when they remember something too clearly because they haven't been able to stop thinking about it. If you're hearing this for the first time on this channel, welcome. We publish stories like this every week, and if you've ever experienced something in a place that felt different, you know where to find me. Rodrigo asked me to tell his complete story, without cutting anything out. So that's what I'm going to do. This is what happened to him when he decided to photograph a forest that the locals don't talk about. I am a photographer. I have been working independently for 7 years, doing everything, advertising, portraits, events, whatever comes my way. But my favorite job, the one I do when I have free time and some saved money, is landscape and nature photography. I venture into difficult places with the camera and spend hours waiting for the right light, the exact composition. It is a solitary and patient job that suits my personality well. In February of last year, Celeste invited me to spend a weekend at her family's cabin in the Cordoba Mountains. Celeste and I have known each other since university. We are friends who don't see each other often, but when we do, we pick up exactly where we left off. She was going with a couple of other friends. I went because I needed to get out of the city and because the area is photographically interesting. Hills, native forests, clear night skies. We arrived on a Friday afternoon. The cabin was spacious and comfortable, with a gallery overlooking the hill and a small river that could be heard from the rooms. We had a nice dinner that night, drank wine, and talked late into the night. Everything was exactly what one expects from a weekend in the mountains. Rest, clean air, conversation without urgency. The next day, Saturday, I left early with the camera while the others were still sleeping. I walked along the path that ascended from the cabin towards the hill, searching for the morning light that in the Cordoba Mountains has a particular quality, almost golden and horizontal, that lasts only a few minutes before becoming ordinary. It was during that walk that I saw the forest. It was off to the side of the path, to the west, denser than the surrounding vegetation, with taller and darker trees than those on the rest of the hill. It wasn't huge, but it had a compactness that made it appear deeper than it probably was. The morning light didn't enter it in the same way it did the rest of the landscape. Inside, everything was shadow and gloom, even though the sun was already quite high. It seemed photographically perfect to me. I took several photos from the outside, from the edge where the dense vegetation began. The contrast between the light of the hill and the interior shadow of the forest was exactly the kind of composition I like. That border between the illuminated and the dark that suggests two distinct worlds. I returned to the cabin with good material and spent the rest of the morning reviewing the photos on the camera screen while Celeste and her friends had breakfast. "What's that forest to the west of the path?" I asked. The three looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret at that moment. "Did you go there?" Celeste asked. "Only to the edge. I took photos from outside." Celeste shrugged with that gesture of hers that means she doesn't want to get into a topic. "The neighbors say that place is strange," she said. "They don't go there." "Strange how?" "I don't know. Country things. You know how those stories are." I didn't ask more, but I kept thinking about the forest for the rest of the day. That afternoon, while Celeste and her friends went to town to buy things for dinner, I returned to the trail with the camera. I wanted photos with the afternoon light, which in the mountains has a completely different tone than in the morning, more orange and more lateral, which makes the textures of the bark and leaves appear with a definition that the frontal midday light flattens. I reached the edge of the forest and started photographing from the outside, as I had in the morning. The photos were good, with that threshold quality that I had liked. But as the minutes passed and the light changed, I felt the urge to enter. Just a few meters, enough to photograph from the inside out, which is a completely different perspective. I entered. The change was immediate, not just in light, but in everything. The sound of the wind that had been present all afternoon disappeared the moment I crossed the threshold of the first trees. The air became stiller, denser, with a smell of damp earth and something decaying plant-like that was not unpleasant but was very intense, too intense for the time of year. February in Cordoba is hot and dry. That smell belonged to another season, to another kind of humidity. I photographed outward, toward the light of the hill visible between the trunks, and the photos were exactly what I wanted. That feeling of being inside something dark looking out at a bright world. I moved forward a few more meters, searching for a better angle. It was then that I noticed the silence. Not the silence of the wind that had disappeared upon entering, but something more total. No birds, no insects, no rustling of branches. The forest was completely silent in a way that forests normally are not even the densest ones. Forests always have sound, the movement of small animals, the rustle of leaves, something. This had nothing. I noticed it, I registered it, and I archived it as interesting rather than concerning. I am one of those who feel curiosity before fear in the face of the unknown. I kept photographing. I had been inside the forest for maybe 15 minutes when I heard the first sound. It was a very soft sound, hard to locate, like footsteps on dry leaves, but too slow and too spaced out to be a small animal, and too light to be something big. They came from somewhere to my left, but when I turned in that direction, the sound seemed to come from another side. I stood still and listened. The footsteps, or whatever they were, stopped as well. I waited a minute, two, total silence. I kept walking, now with a bit more attention to my surroundings than before. The light outside was fading. Inside the forest, where it was already twilight at that hour, it was getting dark. I decided to start heading back. I walked in the direction I had entered, or at least in the direction I thought I had entered. The forest wasn't large. I had gone in about 20 or 30 meters, no more. I should have reached the edge in less than a minute. I didn't. I walked what seemed to me more than enough, and the forest continued around me, just as dense, without the clearing of the hill visible between the trunks. I turned 90 degrees and walked in that direction. Still nothing. I turned again. The forest remained the same in all directions. Dark trees, leaf-covered ground, increasing twilight. That's when I felt something akin to fear for the first time. Not panic, not yet, but an internal alarm. A signal that something was not right in the geometry of that place. I took out my phone to use the GPS. No signal, which was strange because in the Cordoba Mountains, although the signal is weak, there is almost always something. There was absolutely nothing there, not even a bar. I breathed. I thought logically, forests are not mazes. If I walk in a straight line in any direction, I will eventually come out. I chose a direction and walked with a determined stride, counting the steps to maintain a straight line. I reached 100 steps, and the forest remained the same. 200 steps, still the same. At 300 steps, I stopped. I was in the center of something that shouldn't be possible. A forest that, by its dimensions visible from the outside, couldn't be more than 100 meters in diameter but seemed to have no limit inside. It was at that moment of stopping when I saw it. Among the trees, about 20 meters away, there was a figure. An old man, standing completely still, looking at me. It was hard to see the details in the dim light, but I could make out the silhouette. Thin, standing straight despite the age, suggested by his white hair and posture, with something that could have been dark clothing or simply the shadow clinging to him too tightly. He did not greet me. He did not move. He was just there, looking at me. "Good afternoon," I said. My voice sounded strange in that silence, too present, too alone. The old man did not respond. "I got lost," I said. "Can you show me the way out?" Nothing, motionless. I walked a few steps towards him. The old man remained unmoving, but something changed in the way I perceived him. As I got closer, his silhouette did not gain more detail. It remained just as blurry, just as vague, as if the distance between us was not changing even though I was clearly moving towards him. I stopped at what I estimated to be about 10 meters away. "Can you hear me?" The old man slowly raised an arm and pointed to my right. A clear gesture, without ambiguity. That direction. I don't know if it was smart or not, but I listened to him. I turned to the right and walked. After 50 steps, the forest opened up. I emerged at the edge, on the hill, into the light of the sunset, which by that time was almost orange and horizontal. I came out breathing harder than I had realized I was breathing, and I stopped with my hands on my knees for a few seconds, simply existing in the open space. When I straightened up and looked back towards the forest, there was no one. The old man was not at the edge. There was no visible figure among the trees. I walked back to the cabin without stopping. Celeste and her friends were already preparing dinner when I arrived. They looked at my face and Celeste immediately asked what had happened. I told her. The three listened in silence, without interrupting me. When I finished, one of Celeste's friends, named Patricia and from the area, said something that stuck with me. My grandmother always said that in that forest lives something that watches over the place. That it doesn't harm those who enter with good intentions, but it also doesn't let them leave alone. That you have to wait for it to show you the way. Watches over the place from what? I asked. Patricia shrugged. From the people who come to do harm, I suppose. Hunting without permission, cutting down trees, that kind of thing. My grandmother said that forest has been there long before the village and has its own way of protecting itself. And the old man? Who is the old man? The three of them looked at each other. My grandmother said that the old man is part of the forest. Patricia said that he is not a person, that he is the form the forest takes when it needs to communicate with someone. We ate in silence for a while after that. That night I didn't sleep well. Not because I was exactly afraid, but because my brain couldn't stop processing what I had experienced. The geometric impossibility of the forest, the total silence, the old man pointing without moving, the exit that appeared exactly where he indicated. I am a photographer. I work with visible reality, with the light that exists, with the objects that are there and that the lens captures. I have a very concrete relationship with the physical world, and what I had experienced in that forest did not correspond to anything I understood about how the physical world works. At 2 a.m, with the others asleep, I turned on the camera screen and reviewed the photos I had taken inside the forest. The photos from when I entered, the first ones I took photographing outward, were perfectly fine. Clear, correctly exposed, exactly what I remembered photographing. The photos I took afterward, the ones I took while walking in search of the exit, were something else. In several of them, among the trees, there was a shape. Not the old one I had seen from the front later, but something different. A dark blot, without a clear human form, that appeared in different positions in consecutive photos, as if it had moved between one photo and the next. In one photo, it was behind a thick trunk. In the next, it was to the left, closer. In the following one, it was directly behind me, captured because I had turned the camera looking for an angle. I looked at that last photo for a long time. The dark blot in that photo was less than 2 meters from where I had been standing, and I hadn't seen it, hadn't felt anything behind me, hadn't had any indication that something was so close. I turned off the camera and sat in the darkness of the room for a long while. The next morning, Sunday, while Celeste and the others were still sleeping, I went to the trail, not to enter the forest, only to see it from the outside, from a distance, in the clean morning light. It looked exactly the same as the first day, dense, dark inside, that border between the light of the hill and the inner shadow that had seemed so photographically interesting to me 48 hours earlier. There was something different, however. At the edge of the forest, exactly where I had exited the previous afternoon, there was a stone, a medium-sized, smooth, dark gray stone that hadn't been there when I left. I'm sure of it because I would have seen it. I would have photographed it. It was exactly the kind of detail that I record. The stone was alone at the edge of the vegetation, as if placed there intentionally. I didn't touch it. I didn't photograph it. I looked at it for a moment and then turned around and went back to the cabin. When Celeste got up and I told her about the stone, her expression was that of someone who decides to talk about something they would rather not discuss. The first time I came to this cabin as a girl, she said, my mom told me that this forest was a place that deserved respect. That if one ever passed nearby, it was better not to enter. She didn't explain why. She just said it was a place that had its own rules. And the stone. I don't know what it means, but it seems to me that it's better to leave it where it is. We left it where it was. We left that Sunday at noon. On the way back to the city, while Celeste drove and the others dozed in the back seats, I was looking at the photos on the camera again, the ones from the forest. The photos of the dark spot were still there, just as clear, just as inexplicable. But there was something else I hadn't noticed the night before. In the photo where the spot was behind me, less than 2 meters away, if one looked closely towards the back, among the farthest trees, there was a much more defined shape. It was the old man, standing, among the trunks, looking towards the camera. I hadn't seen it at that moment. At that moment, I had only seen the stain up close, and I had turned looking for an angle, not knowing that further back, in the shadows, there was a completely still figure watching everything. I showed the photo to Celeste at a traffic light. She looked at it for a second, and then turned her eyes back to the road without saying anything. Celeste, I said. Yes, I saw it. What do you think? Silence for several seconds. I think you were lucky that it showed you the way out, she said in the end. I didn't respond. I put the camera in the backpack and looked out the window at the flat field that replaced the mountains as we moved away. I still have those photos. I didn't delete them, although there was a moment when I thought about doing it. I have them in a separate folder on the hard drive, with a file name that doesn't describe them, that says nothing about what they are. I look at them from time to time, not frequently, when I need to remember that reality has more layers than the camera can capture. I haven't returned to the mountains of Cordoba, not out of fear exactly, but because there are places one visits only once and knows it. The forest was one of those places. It let me in, showed me what it had to show, and let me out. I don't need to tempt a second visit. The gray stone I found at the edge of the forest that morning, I still remember with a strange clarity. Clearer, in fact, than many things I did photograph that weekend. As if the brain knows that some things matter, even if they don't remain in images. That's all Rodrigo wanted to tell. End of Rodrigo's story. He wrote to me that since that weekend he reviews his landscape photos more carefully, as he sometimes finds things in the backgrounds that he hadn't noticed while shooting. He says that most are normal shadows, reflections, branches that form shapes. But every so often there is something that doesn't fit, and in those cases, he simply closes the folder and continues with his day. I think it's a sensible way to live with certain experiences. If you ever photographed something that shouldn't be in the image, I would like to know. The comments are there for that. Take care. We'll talk in the next story. Let me tell you something. Of all the messages I have received in this channel, there is one category that troubles me more than the others. The stories that do not start with fear, but with tenderness. Those that begin with something that seems innocent, even beautiful, and only over time reveal what they really are. This story was sent to me by Sofia, a retired nurse from Venezuela who now lives in Spain. She wrote to me with great serenity, like someone who has had time to sort out what she experienced. If you have a story tucked away that no one else would believe, send it to me. Everything is heard here. This is what Sofia witnessed during the 2 months she spent alone in her childhood home, taking care of her sick mother in a town in the Venezuelan Andes. When one has worked 30 years in a hospital, one loses the fear of most things. I say this without arrogance. It is simply what happens when you live with pain and death on a daily basis. You get used to difficult places, to dark hours, to moments when the human body does things that no one wants to see. I was a floor nurse in the internal medicine area and spent 3 decades seeing it all. I wasn't scared to be alone at night in a room with a critical patient. I wasn't scared of the silence in the hallways at 4 in the morning. I believed that nothing could surprise me anymore. I retired 6 years ago and moved to Spain with my son German, who had already been working here for several years. We left Venezuela with just the essentials and built a new life, small but orderly, in a town in Extremadura where the people are calm and the pace is exactly what I needed after so many years in the hospital. But my mother was left in Venezuela. Doña Carmen was 82 years old when I received the call from my cousin telling me that her health had worsened and that she needed someone to take care of her. My brothers couldn't. One lived in Caracas and had his own problems. The other was sick too. I was the only one with time and the training to understand what my mother needed medically. I spoke with German. He understood. I bought the ticket and in March 3 years ago, I returned to the town where I was born for the first time in more than 7 years. The town hadn't changed much. Those locations in the Venezuelan Andes have a particular stability. The same bahareque houses, the same dirt streets, the same white church in the square, the same mountain cold that seeps into your bones at dawn and dusk, even though during the day the sun heats strongly. Time in those places seems to move differently, slower, thicker, as if the hours carried more weight. My parents' house was at the upper part of the town, at the end of a narrow street, with a small garden in front and a large plot of land behind, where as a child I played among the peach trees and the corn plants that my dad planted. My dad had died 12 years ago. The house had been solely my mother's for all that time, and it showed. The front garden was neglected, the paint on the facade faded, some tiles on the roof displaced. But the structure was solid and inside, although modest, my mother kept it reasonably well with the help of a girl from the village who did the errands and cleaning twice a week. My mother welcomed me with joy and the discreet pride of older people who do not want to admit that they need help. She was weak, with heart failure that her doctors managed with medication, and with reduced mobility that forced her to use a cane and made her depend on others for things she used to do alone. But mentally she was clear, completely herself, with that dry humor and quiet dignity that always characterized her. I settled into my childhood room, which my mother had kept almost the same as I remembered. The same narrow wooden bed, the same cedar wardrobe that smelled of mothballs, the same crucifix above the door. It was a small but familiar room, with that quality of spaces that belonged to you in another life. The first days were about adapting and establishing a routine, getting up early, preparing my mother's breakfast, administering her medications on schedule, shopping at the plaza store, cooking, and keeping her company during her afternoon television time. It was a calm job, one of patient care, that I knew well from the hospital but had a different dimension when the person you were caring for was your own mother. I didn't notice anything strange during the first week. It was at the beginning of the second week that I heard the girl for the first time. It was night, past midnight. My mother was sleeping. I had just checked that her medications were where she would need them at dawn, and I was returning to my room through the central hallway of the house. The hallway was dark, barely illuminated by the moonlight coming through the back window, and as I crossed it, I heard a sound coming from the backyard, a child's voice, singing. I stopped dead in my tracks. It was a song I recognized immediately, a round that was sung in that town when I was a child, one of those that generations of children learn from each other without anyone explicitly teaching them, that simply exist in the collective repertoire of childhood in all small towns. The voice singing it was that of a little girl, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, with that slightly off-key intonation that children have when they sing alone. My first reaction was completely rational. Some girl from the neighborhood who couldn't sleep and had gone out to her backyard. The backyards of the houses in that town were adjacent, separated only by low wooden fences or not very high block walls. It was perfectly possible to hear someone in the next yard. I went to my room without further thought and fell asleep without issue. But the next day during breakfast, I mentioned the matter to my mother. "Who lives next door now?" I asked. "Last night I heard a girl singing in the yard." My mother looked at me with an expression that at that moment I couldn't interpret well. "Next door lives Mrs. Petra," she said. "Alone. Her children are in Maracaibo. Doesn't she have grandchildren who visit her?" "No one has come to visit her for a long time." I shrugged and didn't ask any more. I thought about the other neighbors, about some family with children that I hadn't met yet, and filed the matter away as unimportant. The second time I heard the girl was 3 nights later. Same time, past midnight, the same song. This time I got up and went to the kitchen window, which faced the backyard, and looked outside. The courtyard was empty. The moon was full that month and there was enough light to see clearly. The old peach trees, the well that was no longer used, the dry bushes of the lot. There was no girl. There was no person. The voice kept singing. I stood at the window for several minutes, listening, trying to determine exactly where the sound was coming from. It was hard to locate. It seemed to come from the courtyard, but it could also come from deeper inside, from closer, from somewhere that did not correspond to any exterior space. Then, with the same naturalness with which it had begun, the voice stopped. I stood in front of the window for a while longer, looking at the empty courtyard, with a feeling that was not exactly fear, but something more like perplexity. 30 years in the hospital had taught me to stay calm in the face of the inexplicable. When one has seen what happens to human bodies at the edge of life, one develops a capacity to be present in the unknown without collapsing. But this was different from anything I had seen in the hospital. The next day I asked my mother, more carefully this time, if she had ever heard voices at night in the house. My mother was silent for a moment before answering. "Sometimes," she said, "a girl's voice, singing." I looked at her. "How long has this been going on?" "For a long time. I heard it sometimes even before your dad died. He never wanted to talk about it." "And you? Are you scared?" My mother looked at me with the calmness of someone who has lived long enough to have made peace with most things. "I got used to it," she said. "It sings and then it goes away. Nothing else has ever happened." I asked her to tell me everything she remembered. My mother, with her usual slowness in recounting things, gave me details over the following days, in snippets, whenever she felt like talking, that the voice always sounded at night, almost always after midnight, never for more than a few minutes, that it always sang the same song, that she had once asked Father Mateo, the village priest, and he had told her to pray and not to pay attention. "And is that all he told you?" I asked. "He also told me that that house is very old and that old houses keep things." I asked her what things. My mother shrugged her shoulders with that gesture of hers that meant there were topics better left unexamined. Another week passed without me hearing anything. I began to think that perhaps the sound had some acoustic explanation that I had not identified. The wind in the trees of the yard, some small animal, something structural in the old walls of the house. I repeated it to myself several times, with more conviction than I really felt. Then I saw her. It was a Tuesday. My mother had had a difficult day, with high blood pressure and a fatigue that had taken her to bed before 8 in the evening. I stayed in the living room doing something on my phone, with the table lamp on, in the quiet silence of the sleeping house. At 10:30, without any prior sound to announce anything to me, I lifted my eyes from the phone and saw her. She was standing in the hallway doorway, about 4 meters from where I was sitting. She was a girl of perhaps 6 years, wearing a dark dress that seemed from another era, her long hair loose over her shoulders, and her bare feet on the tiled floor. She was looking at me with an expression that was not the expression of children, too still, too fixed, lacking the natural mobility of a child's face. I didn't scream. I didn't get up suddenly. I remained absolutely still, looking at her, while my mind processed what my eyes were seeing. The girl did not move. She continued to look at me with that stillness that did not belong to any living child I had ever known in my life, and which was more disturbing than any threatening gesture. She was simply there, present, with an attention that was anything but childlike. "Who are you?" I said softly. The girl did not respond, but something happened that completely froze me. She tilted her head to one side, very slowly, at an angle that a real child could make. But in that context, with that stillness, with that fixity, it turned out to be the most disturbing gesture I had ever seen in my life. Then she disappeared. She didn't walk away, she didn't turn around. She simply ceased to exist. I sat in the chair without moving for a time I cannot calculate. The hallway was empty. The house was silent. The lamp was still on the table. I got up, went to the hallway, checked each room. There was nothing. The front door was locked from the inside, just as I always left it. The windows were locked too. There was no way a real child could have been in that room and left without me seeing or hearing. That night I didn't sleep. I sat on the bed with the light on until dawn. The next day I went to the church to look for Father Mateo. He was a man of about 60, tall and calm, with that specific serenity that some priests have after decades in small towns, and having heard everything. I found him in the sacristy and asked to speak with him. I told him about the voice, about the figure in the threshold. Father Mateo listened to me without interrupting, with his hands clasped on the table, with an expression that was not of surprise but of measured recognition. When I finished, he was silent for a moment. "That house has a history," he said. "A history that most people in the town know but prefer not to mention." I asked him to tell me. Many years ago, before my parents bought the house, a family had lived there that experienced a tragedy. A little girl died in the backyard, in the well that I had seen dry throughout my childhood. An accident, according to the official version. But Father Mateo, who had arrived in the village many years later but had heard the story from the older parishioners, said that there were versions that did not match the accident and that no one had wanted to investigate too deeply. "What I believe," he said, with a careful precision that I appreciated, "is that that girl did not find the way to leave. That something is holding her here. I don't think it's bad will on her part. I think she is simply lost." I asked him what could be done. What can always be done? Pray for her. Ask her to find rest, not with fear, but with compassion. Presences of this kind respond more to compassion than to fear. I asked him if I should do something more concrete, something more formal. Father Mateo considered this. "I can go to the house and do a blessing, not to expel anything, but to open a way, so that what is trapped can be released." He went to the house 2 days later, on a Thursday afternoon. My mother welcomed him with the joy of someone who sees a familiar and trustworthy person. He calmly walked through the house, praying softly, with holy water and incense, without drama or fuss. It was a serene ritual that lasted perhaps 40 minutes. When he finished, Father Mateo had coffee with my mother and me in the kitchen. "Do you think it worked?" my mother asked, straightforward as always. "I don't know for sure," he said, with the honesty I appreciated. "These things don't always get resolved immediately." but I think she opened something. That night I heard the girl sing for the last time. It was past midnight, just like always. I got up and went to the kitchen window. The yard was bathed in moonlight. The peach trees cast long shadows on the ground. The dry well in the back with its stone curb covered in moss. The voice sang the same song as always, but there was something different about it this time. I don't know how to describe it exactly, but it sounded more distant, as if it were coming from deeper inside something instead of from the yard. And it had a quality that in 30 years of night work at the hospital I had learned to recognize, the quality of something that is leaving, that is at that threshold between being and not being. The song lasted maybe 2 minutes. Then it became fainter, more distant, thinner, until it dissolved into the silence of the night. I never heard it again. I spent another month in the village taking care of my mother until her health stabilized enough for the village girl and my sister's periodic visits to be sufficient. During that month, the house was just a house. Normal creaks, normal wind, the ordinary silence of the early mornings in the Andes. My mother died 8 months later, in her bed, at peace. I couldn't be there at that moment because the journey from Spain was long and I didn't arrive in time. But German flew with me for the wake, and together we spent a few days in the village closing things up, organizing papers, deciding what to do with the house. The night before we left alone, I sat in the living room where I had seen the girl in the doorway. The same chair, the same lamp, the same dark hallway at the back. There was nothing there, just the empty house, with that particular silence that houses have when the person who inhabited them is no longer there. I sat there for a long while, thinking about my mother, about the girl who sang at night, about Father Mateo and his blessing, about that dry well in the yard where something happened that no one wanted to investigate too much. Thinking about all the stories that remain untold in old houses, about the presences that linger because no one told them they could leave. Before turning off the lamp and getting up, I said aloud, in the silence of the empty room, what Father Mateo had suggested to me, to find rest, that it could leave now. I don't know if it did any good. I don't know if what was there was still there or had already found its way before that night, but saying it felt right. Just as certain things feel right, even if they don't have a rational explanation to justify them. We sold the house the following year. A young family from the village with 2 small children bought it. I didn't tell them anything about what I had experienced. I don't know if that was right or wrong. Maybe the girl had already left. Maybe she just needed someone to open the door for her. I hope so. There ends what Sophia wanted to share. She wrote to me at the end that she still thinks about that girl from time to time. Especially at night, when the silence of the town in Extremadura where she now lives resembles a bit the silence of the Andes. She says she is no longer afraid of those thoughts, that sometimes the things that follow us do not want to harm us, they just want someone to remember them. It seems to me one of the most human conclusions I have read in a long time. If you have a story that deserves to be heard, write to me. Have a good night, and take care. A listener who signs as Elena wrote to me from Venezuela a few days ago. She told me that what she is about to share happened to her when she was 35 years old, during a week she spent alone in her recently deceased grandmother's house, sorting through her things. She had never believed in any of this, until that week. If you have an experience with a family member who has passed away and somehow remained present, share it with me below. Now, this is what Elena found among her grandmother's belongings. My grandmother Petra died on a Tuesday in February. She was 83 years old and died as she had lived, on her own terms, in her own bed, without hospitals or machines prolonging something she had already decided to let go of. The last time I visited her, 2 weeks before her death, she took my hand with a strength that did not correspond to someone in that condition, and looked at me with those eyes of hers that always seemed to know something the rest of us did not. Elena, she told me, when I leave, go to the house before anyone else, before your mother, before your uncles, you first. Why? I asked her. Because there are things that are for you, she said, and there are things that are for no one. You have to know how to distinguish which are which. I asked her what she meant. You will understand when you arrive, she said, and she closed her eyes. Those were the last words she spoke directly to me. She died 9 days later, while sleeping, without pain according to those who were present. I am the eldest granddaughter. I was 35 years old then, working as an accountant in a medium-sized company, living alone in an apartment that was exactly the right size for a person who prefers order and silence. I was skeptical by nature, the kind that needs to see to believe, and that when she sees first looks for an explanation before accepting anything else. That was me before that week. My grandmother Petra's house was in an old neighborhood of the city, a house like those from before, with a tiled roof and thick walls, and an interior patio with a lemon tree that she tended to with almost ceremonial dedication. She had lived there alone for the last 12 years, since my grandfather died. The family visited her regularly, but no one lived with her because she did not allow it. I arrived 2 days after her death, just as she had asked me, before my mother and uncles who were organizing the arrangements from another city. I had had the keys for years. I entered alone. The smell of the house was the same as always. Lavender, coffee, old wood, something sweet that I had never been able to identify precisely, but that I completely associated with her. Everything was tidy as always because my grandmother Petra was a woman who did not leave things out of their place. The cups lined up in the kitchen, the books on their shelves, the pictures straight on the walls. There was only one thing different. In the center of the dining table, perfectly centered on the embroidered tablecloth that my grandmother used for special occasions, there was a notebook. It was old, with a black cardboard cover, worn corners, and a spine reinforced with yellowing tape from age. My grandmother had left it there on purpose. That was evident. She had placed it there for me to find. I sat in my usual chair, the one facing the patio window, and opened it. My grandmother's handwriting filled the pages from the first to the last. A handwriting I would recognize among thousands, round and precise, with that characteristic slant of people who learned to write when it was taught as a skill to be perfected. It wasn't exactly a diary. It was more like a record. Dates spanning decades, some entries very short with just a few lines, others occupying several pages. The tone was that of someone documenting, not of someone confessing. Concrete, without drama, like a report of things that happened and that deserved to be written down. I read for hours. What I found in that notebook was the story of a life I thought I knew, which turned out to be considerably more complex than any granddaughter could imagine. My grandmother Petra had had since she was young, a capacity that she described in the notebook with an almost technical neutrality. She could see things that others did not see, not exactly ghosts, at least not in the sense of human figures. She described them as presences, densities in space, accumulations of something that did not have a precise name, but that she had learned to recognize and distinguish from one another, like one learns to distinguish smells. He had spent most of his life learning to live with that, not to be frightened, to establish a functional distance between what he saw and what affected him. There were people in his life who knew about this ability and whom he turned to when he needed guidance. There were situations he had managed, things he had kept away from his family without anyone knowing, protections he had maintained active for decades. Some entries were about my mother when she was a child, about my uncles, about us, the grandchildren. There were several about me. The first era was when I was 6 years old. She described something she had noticed in me, an undeveloped ability, a potential she recognized because she had it herself. She wrote with a mix of satisfaction and concern that I understood perfectly. The satisfaction of recognizing something familiar, the concern of knowing what it implies. The entries about me continued over the years, observations of things I did or said that went unnoticed by others, but that she noticed attentively. Moments when I had reacted to something without knowing exactly what. The time when, at 12 years old, I refused to go into the basement of a relative's house without being able to explain why. And she simply wrote in her notebook, "Elena felt it. She doesn't know what she felt, but she felt it. Good." I reached the last pages when it had already darkened outside and I had completely forgotten to turn on the lights in the house. I was reading with the natural light from the patio that filtered through the window, increasingly dim. The last entries were recent, from the last few months, written in a handwriting that seemed more strained, as if the hand struggled more than before, but the will to write was equally strong. The last entry was from 3 weeks before her death, 1 week before my last visit. It said, There is something in the house that has been here for a long time and that I have kept still. It's not exactly bad, but it's not neutral either. It's something that remained from those who lived here before us, something that anchored itself to this place before I arrived. For decades, I learned to coexist with it and to ensure that it didn't expand outward. But I am leaving, and when I go, there will be no one to contain it anymore. Elena has what it takes to handle it, even though she doesn't know it yet. I am going to leave her instructions. She will know what to do. Underneath, there was a folded page, clipped to the inside of the back cover, that I hadn't seen until that moment. I peeled it off and opened it. There were instructions, written in the same precise handwriting, organized in numbered steps. What I was supposed to look for, what I was supposed to do with what I found. The words I was supposed to say, written phonetically with a note that said, "Don't ask where these words come from, just say the exact ones." At the end of the instructions, a brief note, "Don't be afraid. Fear is the only possible mistake. What is in this house will recognize you just as I recognized you. That is an advantage, not a danger. Use it." I sat in the darkness of the dining room for a time I did not measure. A part of me, the counting part, the skeptical part of 35 years with no experience that contradicted its worldview, wanted to fold that page, put the notebook in a box, and call my mother to tell her what I had found. Another part of me, an older and harder to name part, already knew I was going to follow the instructions. I started that very night. The first thing I had to do, according to my grandmother Petra's instructions, was to walk through each room of the house with the lights off and simply pay attention, not to look for anything, not to expect anything specific, just to pay attention. I walked through the house in the dark, the living room, the kitchen, the bathroom, the guest room where I slept when I came to visit her, my grandmother's bedroom, which smelled more intensely of lavender and her than any other space, and where I paused a moment longer than expected, processing the absence. And then the room at the end of the hall, the one that had always been locked, the one I had never seen open in all the years I had been visiting that house. The one that, when I was a child, I asked my grandmother what was inside. She simply replied, "Things you don't need to see yet." The key was in the notebook, inside a small envelope glued to the first page that I had felt when I opened it but had not yet explored. I opened the room. Inside there was a small room, completely empty of furniture, with walls painted a white that had acquired a yellowish tone over the years. In the center of the floor, there was a circle drawn with something that looked like salt, perfectly intact. Inside the circle, a small object, a dark green stone, almost black, the size of my fist, with an irregular shape that did not correspond to any natural stone I knew. It had markings on the surface that could have been natural erosion or could have been deliberately engraved. The temperature in that room was noticeably lower than in the rest of the house. And there was something else, a presence, which is the only word I can use, although I know it is not precise, that I felt in a way that was none of the 5 conventional senses but was absolutely real. Like the awareness that there is someone in the room before you see them, only denser, older. I remembered what my grandmother had written. "He will recognize you." I stood at the threshold and let him recognize me. I don't know how long I was like that. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe 20. At some point, the presence changed. It didn't disappear, but something in it settled, like when someone who was standing sits down, a relaxation of something that had been tense. I followed the instructions. What I did in that room during the next hour, I will recount only in general terms, not because I want to be mysterious, but because there are parts of my grandmother's instructions that she herself wrote that should not be repeated aloud or in writing. I took that seriously. The instructions involved the stone, the circle of salt, the words she had written phonetically, and an object that I had brought without knowing I would bring it, because the instructions said that I would have something of mine with me that would serve the purpose and that I would recognize what it was when the time came. I recognized what it was. It was a necklace that my grandmother had given me years ago, which I always wore without knowing exactly why, which I had never been able to leave at home even though sometimes it felt uncomfortable or out of place with certain clothes. Everything I'm going to say about what happened when I followed the last steps of the instructions is this. There was a moment when the temperature in the room dropped even further, to the point where I could see the steam from my own breath, and at that moment, The presence concentrated in a way that I can't describe except to say that it was as if all the space in the room compressed towards a point, and then it expanded, quickly, like an exhalation. And after that, the room was at the same temperature as the rest of the house, and the presence was no longer there. I sat on the floor in the middle of the broken salt circle, with the necklace in my hand, and stayed there for a long time doing nothing. When I went out, I picked up the stone with a cloth as the instructions indicated, without touching it directly, and took it to the yard. I dug a hole next to the lemon bush, which is where the instructions said I should bury it. My grandmother had written, "The lemon tree is the most honest tree in the garden. What is buried beneath it remains neutral." I buried the stone. I went back inside, washed my hands, turned on the lights, and made myself a coffee. That night I slept in the guest room and slept well, with that quiet depth that sleep has when the body has used energies it didn't know it had. The following days I spent organizing the house as I had promised, sorting out my grandmother's things for the family. My mother and my uncles arrived on the third day. None of them noticed anything different in the house. None asked about the room at the end of the hallway, which I had locked again. I didn't tell them anything. Not because I wanted to keep the secret indefinitely, but because at that moment I didn't have the words to tell it in a way that didn't sound like delirium, and because I had kept my grandmother's notebook in my bag and felt that it was mine before it belonged to anyone else. It still is. I have it at home, in a drawer that I don't open frequently, but that I know is there. I have reread certain parts many times. The entries about me, especially those that describe things she noticed in me that I never noticed in myself. And yet upon reading them, I recognize. Like when someone describes a trait of yours that has always been there, but for which you never had a name. Has anything changed since that week? Yes, not dramatically. I don't wake up seeing apparitions or hearing voices, but there is something that works differently in me now, an awareness that I didn't have before or that I had without knowing how to use it. I enter a place and know things about it that I shouldn't know through any conventional means. Sometimes it's uncomfortable. Most of the time, over time, it has seemed useful to me. My grandmother Petra knew what she was doing when she chose me. I have no doubt about that. And I have no doubts about the week in that house, about what I felt in that room, about the temperature that dropped and the presence that left, about the stone that is buried under the lemon tree in the yard of a house that now belongs to the family and that no one is going to unearth because no one knows it is there, except for me. And now, you. That is all Elena wanted to share. She told me it took her a long time to decide to send it, that she didn't know how it would sound written down. To me, it sounds exactly as it should, like something true. If a senior family member ever left you something, an object, a letter, a warning that you didn't fully understand at the time, I would love to read it in the comments. And if this story found you tonight while you were resting, consider subscribing to keep receiving more. Until the next story, take care. This story was sent to me by a follower named Patricia, who worked as a librarian at a private university. What she experienced during a nighttime inventory made her quit her job and move to another city. If you've ever felt like a book is watching you, let me know in the comments. Now, this is Patricia's experience with a grimoire that should never have come into human hands. My name is Patricia, and for 5 years I worked as a librarian at San Agustin University, a private institution in Guanajuato, Mexico. It was a quiet job that I loved, organizing books, helping students with their research, spending hours among shelves full of knowledge. I never imagined that this love for books would almost cost me my sanity. It all started when the university received a massive donation of old books. A private collector had passed away without heirs, and his will specified that his entire library should be donated to our institution. There were over 3,000 volumes, some dating back to the 16th century. My supervisor, Dr. Mendez, was ecstatic. "Patricia, this is incredible. We have first editions, original manuscripts, incunabula. We will need weeks to catalog all of this properly." The books arrived in wooden boxes on a cargo truck on a Tuesday in September. We unloaded them in the basement of the library, where we had a special room for old materials with temperature and humidity control. There were so many boxes that we could barely move between them. "We will start the inventory this weekend. announced Dr. Mendez. Patricia, I will pay you overtime if you can come on Saturday night. We will work in shifts to progress faster. I accepted without thinking. The extra money would be good for me, and the idea of being the first to examine those bibliographic treasures was exciting. On Saturday, I arrived at the library at 8 in the evening. The building was empty and silent, illuminated only by emergency lights in the hallways. Dr. Mendez was already in the basement, surrounded by open boxes and piles of books. Perfect, Patricia. I've been cataloging for 2 hours and I've barely made progress. There are real gems here. Look at this. She showed me a book bound in red leather, a first edition of Don Quixote from 1605. Can you believe it? We worked in silence during the early hours, each at her station, recording titles, authors, publication dates, and condition. Most of the books were religious texts, philosophical works, and some ancient scientific treatises. Fascinating but normal for an 18th century collection. Around 11 at night, I opened a box that was marked with a strange symbol instead of a number. Inside were only 5 books, all individually wrapped in black cloth. Unwrapping the first, I found a thin volume bound in something that looked like leather, but had a strange, almost scaly texture. It had no title on the cover. I opened it carefully and saw that the pages were made of yellowed parchment, covered with handwritten Latin. There were illustrations too, circles with symbols, complex geometric figures, and drawings of creatures that were neither completely human nor animal. Dr. Mendez, you should see this, I called. She approached, put on her reading glasses, and examined the book. Her expression changed from curiosity to discomfort. It's a grimoire, she finally said. A book of ceremonial magic, probably from the 17th century. I see references to invocations, protection rituals, demonic seals. Fascinating from a historical standpoint, though chilling. Is it dangerous to have it? She laughed. Only if you believe in magic, Patricia. For us, it's simply a historical artifact that shows the beliefs of the time, but let's catalog it carefully. This type of text is rare and valuable. I continued examining the book, trying to decipher the Latin with my limited knowledge. There were sections on invoking spirits, creating amulets, curses. One page in particular caught my attention. It had the illustration of a mirror surrounded by symbols, and below, written in red ink that seemed to be blood, there was a warning in Old Spanish. Whoever reads these words aloud will open the door. What comes cannot be returned. A chill ran through me, but I attributed it to the air conditioning in the basement. I kept flipping through the pages, documenting each section. Then I reached a part of the book where the pages were stuck together, sealed with black wax that had a printed symbol. It was as if someone had wanted to ensure that those pages were never read. Curiosity got the better of me. Using a conservation spatula, I began to carefully separate the sealed pages. The wax broke with a dry crack that resonated in the silence of the basement. The moment the pages opened, the temperature in the room dropped drastically. My breath became visible. The lights flickered. What was that? Dr. Mendez asked, looking up from her work. I don't know. I think there's a problem with the air conditioning system. But I knew it wasn't that. There was something different in the air. A pressure, a density that hadn't been there before. And a smell. Sulfur mixed with something sweet and rotten. I looked at the pages I had opened. They contained a ritual, written in Latin, but with some words in a language I didn't recognize. There were detailed instructions, a circle that needed to be drawn, words that needed to be spoken, and in the center of the page, written in large letters, Invocation of the Dark Mirror. Without thinking, without really realizing what I was doing, I began to read the words aloud. It wasn't classical Latin, but something older, more guttural. The words flowed from my mouth with a strange ease, as if I had known them my whole life. Patricia, what are you doing? Dr. Mendez's voice sounded distant, even though she was only 3 meters away. I couldn't stop. The words kept flowing, my voice taking on an intonation that wasn't mine. I completed the invocation, pronounced the last syllable, and then, absolute silence. The lights stopped flickering. The temperature remained cold but stable. I looked at Dr. Mendez, who was watching me with a worried expression. Are you feeling okay? You turned very pale. Yes, I don't know what happened to me. It was like I couldn't control my voice. I think we should take a break. We've been working for hours. Let's go up for coffee. I closed the grimoire, feeling stupid and embarrassed. What had I done? reading aloud a ritual from an ancient book of magic as if it were something real. It was ridiculous. We went up to the first floor where there was a small cafe for staff. While Dr. Mendez made coffee, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. I looked normal. Same face, same brown hair tied in a ponytail, same brown eyes. Except that for a second, just a second, I saw something different in the reflection. My eyes were not brown. They were completely black. I blinked and everything returned to normal. Just tiredness, I told myself. Too many hours staring at ancient text under artificial light. We returned to the basement with our coffee. Dr. Mendez suggested we leave the grimoires for last and focus on the more conventional texts. I agreed, grateful to postpone working with those unsettling books. We worked in silence for another hour. Then I heard something. A soft whisper, as if someone were speaking in the adjacent room. I stopped, listening intently. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Dr. Mendez shook her head. "What thing?" "Voices. Like whispers. Probably the ventilation system. This building is old. It makes strange noises at night." But the whispers continued, and now I could distinguish that they were words, although in a language I didn't understand. They were coming from all directions at once, surrounding me. I got up, searching for the source of the sound. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and then I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the back wall of the basement, where there were no windows or mirrors, a reflection had appeared. It was as if an invisible mirror was there, showing an image that did not correspond with reality. The reflection showed the same basement but different, darker, with the walls covered in symbols that glowed with a sickly light. And in that reflected basement, there were figures. Humanoid shadows moving, seeming to be working on something, preparing something. "Dr. Mendez, do you see that?" I pointed toward the wall. She looked. "See what? It's just the wall. The reflection, the figures." "Patricia, there's nothing there. I think you really need to rest. You've been working too much." But I saw it clearly. And now one of the figures had turned towards me, looking directly at me. It had no face, just a darkness where features should have been. It raised a hand, pointing at me. I stepped back, tripping over a box. The sudden movement caused the grimoire I had been examining to fall to the ground, opening to the pages of the ritual I had read. The lights went out completely. In the darkness, I heard Dr. Mendez's voice. "Patricia, where is your flashlight? Mine won't turn on." I took out my cell phone to use the screen light, but it was dead even though it had a full battery when we went down. I fumbled for my emergency flashlight. When I finally turned it on, I illuminated the basement. Dr. Mendez was standing near her workstation, looking around in confusion. But behind her, on the wall that had previously shown the strange reflection, there was now a real mirror. A large, ornate mirror that definitely hadn't been there before. "Doctor, turn slowly," I said in a trembling voice. She turned and saw the mirror. Her expression shifted from confusion to shock. That wasn't there 5 minutes ago." We approached cautiously. The mirror was old, with a carved wooden frame bearing the same symbols I had seen in the grimoire. The surface of the glass was dark, not reflecting clearly like a normal mirror. The images in it were distorted, blurry, and as we looked, the reflection changed. Instead of showing the basement with the two of us, it displayed a completely different place. A vast and dark space, illuminated only by what appeared to be glowing embers. And in that space, things were moving. Creatures that were vaguely humanoid, but completely wrong in their proportions and movements. "We need to get out of here now," Dr. Mendez said. "This is not natural. I will call security, the rector, whoever is necessary." We ran to the basement door, but when we tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. The doorknob turned, but the door remained sealed, as if something was keeping it shut from the other side. "Help!" shouted Dr. Mendez, banging on the door. "Is there someone up there?" There was no response. The building was empty except for us, and the thick walls of the basement were probably blocking any sound. Behind us we heard a sound like glass breaking. We turned and saw that the mirror had cracked, but the cracks were not normal. They formed patterns, the same symbols from the grimoire, and through the cracks, something was coming out. It was smoke at first, black and dense, flowing from the mirror like water. Then the smoke began to solidify, to take shape. It condensed into a humanoid figure about 2 meters tall, but with limbs that extended too far, with joints bending in the wrong directions. The creature had no face, just a smooth surface where features should have been. but I could feel it watching us, evaluating us. "What is that?" whispered Dr. Mendez, her voice barely audible. I didn't have time to respond. The creature moved incredibly fast, crossing the basement in an instant. It grabbed Dr. Mendez by the arm. She screamed, trying to free herself, but the grip was like iron. "Let her go!" I shouted, grabbing the first thing I found, a heavy metal-bound book, and hitting the creature. The book passed through its form as if it were smoke. It wasn't completely solid. The creature released Dr. Mendez, who fell to the ground, rubbing her arm. Where the creature had touched her, her skin was darkened, like frostbite or a burn. Then the creature spoke, not with sound, but directly in our minds. "It was you who opened the door, you who spoke the words. Now we must complete the exchange." "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, although a part of me knew exactly what he was referring to. The ritual I had read, summoning of the dark mirror. I had invoked something. I had opened a door between our world and another place. A soul for knowledge. That is the price. It has always been the price. I didn't ask for knowledge. I don't want anything from you. The words were spoken. The seal was broken. The deal is done. Choose, you or her. Dr. Mendez looked at me with terrified eyes. I was maybe 30 years old. She was 62, close to retirement, had grandchildren. But the idea of offering someone else, of condemning another person for my mistake. "No," I said firmly. "I'm not going to choose. There has to be another way." The creature tilted its faceless head as if considering. "There is an alternative. If you can close the door you opened, if you can reverse the summoning before dawn, but you will fail. Everyone fails." "How? How do you close it?" The creature pointed towards the grimoire on the ground. "The answers are where it all began. But you must be wiser than you have been." And with that, the creature dissolved back into smoke, retreating back into the mirror. But the mirror remained, and through it we could see that dark place, those shapes moving in the shadows. I helped Dr. Mendez to get up. "Are you okay?" "My arm hurts horribly, but I'll live." "Patricia, what have you done?" "I read the ritual from the grimoire. I didn't think it was real. We need to reverse it. We have until dawn." She looked at her watch. "It's 12:30. The sun rises around 7. We have 6.5 hours. We retrieved the grimoire and took it to the table farthest from the mirror. With trembling hands, I began to search through the pages I had opened. There had to be a way to undo what I had done. I found a section marked reversal and sealing. I read carefully, translating the Latin as best as I could. It required several components: salt, holy water, the blood of the summoner, and the correct words spoken in the right order, at exactly midnight the following night. "Wait," I said. "This says midnight the following night. Does that mean we have to wait until tomorrow?" Dr. Mendez read over my shoulder. "No, look at the margin note. It's in Spanish. It says, if invoked at the wrong hour, the reversal must be completed by the next midnight within the same lunar cycle. Today is a new moon. The next midnight within the cycle is in 6 hours." We had the necessary components or could obtain them. There was a chapel on campus where we could get holy water. The salt was easy. And blood, that would be the hardest part. But it was my blood that was required. "I'll go for the holy water," Dr. Mendez said. "The chapel is in the humanities building. I can get there in 10 minutes if I can get out of this basement." As if it had heard her, the basement door swung open. But what was on the other side was not the normal library hallway. It was darkness, the same darkness we had seen in the mirror. "We can't go out that way," I said. "It's a trap." We explored the basement, looking for another exit. There was a high ventilation window in a wall, barely large enough for a thin person to pass through. Using stacked boxes as a ladder, Dr. Mendez managed to open it and escape. "I'll be back in 30 minutes, she promised. "You stay here, study the ritual, prepare everything. And Patricia, be careful." She left, leaving me alone in the basement with the mirror and whatever was lurking behind it. I spent the next half hour studying the reversal ritual intensely. The words had to be exact, the order specific, the tone correct. One mistake and I would fail, or worse, I could open the door even wider. I prepared the space according to the instructions. I drew a protection circle on the floor using chalk I found in an educational supply, placed candles at specific points around the circle, organized the symbols I would have to copy. As I worked, The mirror pulsed with sickly light. Things on the other side were closing in, pressing against the barrier between worlds. I could feel their hunger, their desire to cross completely. Dr. Mendez returned just before 1 in the morning, bringing a bottle of holy water from the chapel and a packet of salt from the cafeteria. She also brought bandages and alcohol. "For your blood," she explained, "we will need to sterilize the cut." At 1:30, everything was ready. There were 5 hours left until midnight, the moment when we would have to perform the reversal ritual. But the following hours were the longest of my life. The mirror became more active as time passed. The shapes behind it became more defined, more solid, and they began to speak, whispering promises and threats. "Just let us cross. We will give you power, knowledge, everything you desire. Your soul is lost anyway. At least accept our gifts before the end. She will die if you fail. Both will die. Join us willingly, and you will live forever." I tried to ignore them, but the voices filtered into my mind, planting doubts. What if I failed? What if I condemned Dr. Mendez for my mistake? Maybe it would be better to accept the deal. Let them take me. At least save her. "Don't listen to them," Dr. Mendez said firmly. "They are lies. Entities like these offer nothing but destruction." At 6 in the morning, there was 1 hour left. The tension was unbearable. The mirror was now visibly vibrating, cracks forming in the frame. It wouldn't last much longer. If we didn't seal the door soon, it would completely break, and what was on the other side would flood our world. Finally, at 6:55, we began the final preparations. I cut the palm of my hand with a sterilized scalpel, letting my blood drip into a small container. I mixed the blood with the holy water and salt according to the instructions. At exactly 7 o'clock, I began the ritual, standing in the center of the protection circle with Dr. Mendez holding the open grimoire for me to read. I pronounced the words of reversal. This time the words did not flow easily. Each syllable required effort, as if something was trying to prevent me from saying them. The air thickened, resisting. The candles flickered violently. The mirror reacted immediately. The cracks expanded. The shapes behind the glass lunged against the barrier, trying to break it before I completed the ritual. The basement trembled as if in an earthquake. "Continue!" shouted Dr. Mendez over the roar of energy that filled the space. I continued reciting, word by word, pouring the mixture of blood, holy water, and salt at the specific points of the circle. The grimoire specified that I had to complete everything before the last grain of sand fell in an hourglass I had set up. There were perhaps 30 seconds left. The last words came out of my mouth just as the last grain of sand fell. There was a flash of blinding light, a sound like 1,000 crystals breaking, and a wave of force that threw both of us against the walls. When I regained consciousness, I was lying on the floor. Everything was silent. The normal light of dawn was coming through the ventilation window. The candles had gone out. The circle of protection was broken, and the mirror was gone. Only the normal wall remained, with no trace that it had ever been there. "Did it work?" I asked weakly. Dr. Mendez, slowly getting up, examined the grimoire. The pages she had opened were now blank, as if the ink had been absorbed. The wax seal had reformed, sealing those pages again. "I think so," she replied. "You closed the door. Whatever you invoked has been returned." We spent the next few hours cleaning the basement, removing any evidence of the ritual. We placed the grimoire in the special box where it had been, this time making sure it was clearly marked as "Do Not Open, Hazardous Material." When the regular employees arrived on Monday, they found the basement perfectly organized with hundreds of books already cataloged. They never knew what had happened that weekend. But both Dr. Mendez and I knew the truth. We had brushed against something dark, something that existed on the margins of reality, waiting to be invited to cross over. I finished the semester but resigned before the next one. I couldn't keep working surrounded by books, especially old books, without remembering. Without asking myself what other forbidden knowledge was hidden in those pages, what other doors could be opened with the wrong words. Dr. Mendez retired early. The day she left, she gave me one last piece of advice. "There is knowledge that is not meant to be discovered, Patricia. Limits that exist for reasons." What we learned that weekend is that not everything written in ancient books is fiction, and some doors are closed because what is behind them must remain there. I never went back to work in a library. Now I teach elementary school surrounded by children's storybooks and basic math. It's simple, it's safe. And every night before I sleep, I check that there are no mirrors in my room. Because sometimes, in the reflection, I think I see shadows that shouldn't be there. Shapes that watch me from the other side, reminding me that the door is closed. But the things on the other side still remember that it was once opened. And they are waiting, always waiting, in case someone makes the same mistake I made. And with that, the experience that Patricia shared with me concludes. She told me that she now lives in another city and completely avoids old bookstores. If you have ever felt that an old book emanated something more than the smell of old pages, share it in the comments. Sometimes knowledge has a price that we are not prepared to pay. Rest well, and see you in the next story.